morning and welcome to the 28th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee in 2019. Can I remind everyone present to turn off their mobile phones? We've received apologies today from Annabel Ewing and Graham Simpson, and I welcome Tom Mason, who's a substitute for Graham Simpson. Agenda item 1 is consideration of whether to take agenda item 3 in private. Item 3 is consideration of evidence heard today from the Scottish Housing Regulator. Are we all agreed? Thank you. That is agreed. Agenda item 2 is consideration of the Scottish Housing Regulator's annual report and accounts for 2018-19. Before I welcome today's first panel, you may well be aware that the Scottish Housing Regulator has previously undertaken some work on Glasgow City Council's homelessness services. The committee should also be aware that there are ongoing live legal proceedings between Shelter Scotland and Glasgow City Council regarding their homelessness service, and members should avoid discussions on that ongoing case. I welcome from the Scottish Housing Regulator George Walker, who's the Chair, and Michael Cameron, who's the Chief Executive. I invite the Chair to make some brief opening remarks.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr Donnan. Convener, Vice Convener Committee, thanks very much for inviting us along again to present the annual report and accounts. I'd like to highlight just one or two areas for you, if I may. I'll start with our new corporate plan that follows on from the annual report, the corporate plan for 2019 through to 2022, because that sets out our priorities for that period. I don't think these will surprise you when I say that the key priorities are around first tenant and resident safety, homelessness, affordable rents, value for money, and of course something we've discussed with you before, governance and financial health of RSLs. We're also focused on embedding a new regulatory framework which came into operation from the 1st of April this year. And we've put assurance and indeed self-assurance right at the heart of the approach to regulation under that new framework. And right now, as we speak, we're actively using the first set of landlords' annual assurance statements, along with a whole host of other intelligence, of course, to form our risk assessments of landlords. We'll publish the outcome of that in March, and that will include engagement plans for every landlord in Scotland, part of the new framework, and for the first time a regulatory status for each RSL. Over the summer, we've been working closely with SFHA, the Glasgow West of Scotland Forum, and Alacho to develop and publish a toolkit. And that toolkit was to help landlords get the assurance they need that they are meeting all of the responsibilities for their annual assurance statements. We're continuing to work with those partners to develop that toolkit further. So it's working with the sector, if you like. I'd also like to highlight that RSLs and local authorities continue to show really very strong performance against the Charter and its outcomes. I suppose the single biggest highlight of that is that tenant satisfaction remained at a high level at 9 out of 10 tenants satisfied with the overall services that are being provided. So that's a positive story. However, recently we've talked about the challenges for some tenants, in particular in affording their rent. Our national research panel, which is around 450 members, have told us, amongst them, around 2/3 of those participating tenants and service users were concerned about future rent increases and rent affordability in particular. In recent meetings with regional tenant organisations, where Michael and I have had in the last few weeks, they have raised the same issue with us. And so that is something for us to pay some attention to. To set that in some context for you, though, the average rent increase by social landlords in Scotland in the past year was 3.7%, so ahead of inflation quite comfortably. And landlords tell us that they plan to increase rents in the coming year by around 3%. So what we've been urging landlords to do is just take these tenant concerns about future affordability seriously and to vigorously pursue cost efficiency and value for money, of course. Finally, let me just mention that we have continued to use our statutory intervention powers that Parliament have given us, but in fewer organisations, I'm pleased to say. We're currently intervening in just 4 RSLs now, and since we last met you, we recently published 4 new accounts of our interventions, and indeed a wider lessons learned report too, that I think the committee has likely seen. Well, that's a quick summary, Convener. I'm happy to hand back to yourself for any questions the committee have for us.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just ask you, what outcome do you hope to see from the new assurance standards, and what way do you think it's going to improve things?
What really the board and the executive team were looking for that was a significant upstep amongst organisations to become more self-aware. You will likely know, because I think we said it to the committee before, Convener, that in those few cases, and it's a small number, but they're important cases, in those 12 cases where we have taken statutory intervention, in general that has been around governance and financial issues. So what we're looking to achieve from the new framework is, first of all, that all of the organisations are self-assured and have really thoroughly gone through the process of assuring themselves, their own boards and their own executive teams, that they do comply with all the various legislation, regulations and charter standards. So we're really looking to see an uptick in that. That would be the overriding thing that we're looking to do. What was really interesting is we engaged across the process. We spent an 18-month period talking to the sector about how the new framework should work. And actually what was great about that was we got right across Scotland, actually, from Berwick to Moffat and frankly every major city in between. And what was really useful was that at the end point of that was that most of the partners right across the sector responded pretty positively to what we were suggesting, and just a wee reminder of the key elements of that. So there was a lot of support for the annual assurance statements. I think I've just touched on the kind of cornerstone of that, but equally a lot of support for the idea of publishing engagement plans for every single landlord in Scotland, so that there was an enhanced transparency, if you like, and indeed for the idea of publishing a regulatory status and judgment on each landlord. Now I could get into a lot more detail, but I'll maybe leave it there. I don't know if you'd add anything else to that, Michael?
Yeah, I think the only thing to add is that the real driver here for us is to promote that culture of assurance, openness and transparency within landlords, on the basis that that would be the solid foundation for good performance and the delivery of outcomes for tenants and others who use their services.
So can I ask then, would you say that transparency is likely to be a big change as a result of the regulatory review for landlords and tenants, and is the implication just maybe slightly more workload to put that in place?
Well, I think, I would say that we would hope for that enhanced transparency, and I think we're seeing some signs of it. The only thing I'd add to that is actually we're very aware of regulatory burden. We're not trying to create a bureaucracy here for anybody. And so, as an example of that, actually, the ARC, the annual return, that was reviewed as part of that. We removed about 30% of that, actually, so about a third of that. So we're very aware of that idea of regulatory burden. In terms of things like the annual assurance statement, I think we do believe that that provides a much enhanced transparency, because boards themselves are signing those off and saying, yes, we do believe that we're fully compliant, or there's some areas that we're working on. But of course, we're really only asking organisations to give themselves self-assurance on all the areas where they already had an obligation to do so. So it's, if you like, enhancing the transparency part, but we're very aware of the whole issue around regulatory burden and not just piling work on people.
Okay, thank you for that. Rand?
Thank you. In your opening statement, Mr Walker, you talk about the interventions that have taken place with a number of the SRLs. And it's sometimes necessary for you to do that in ensuring the way you go forward. And I think the positive and constructive relationship that takes place, I think is important, because that is a key factor determining whether investors will invest in the RLLs. And I think that's positive. So can I ask about that? How have you incorporated the lessons learned from that statutory interventions?
That's a very good question, actually, and in fact I have with me today the lessons learned report that we published on that, which was quite wide-ranging. I won't steal Michael's thunder, though you might want to comment on some of what has A, the lessons learned, and B, how we've been applying those.
Yeah. So we published the lessons learned report in December last year, and it found the key drivers for intervention are matters which we've discussed with the committee before, actually, but significant weaknesses in governance, failures in leadership within these organisations, and cultures that often left them vulnerable to poor behaviours or incompetence. As George has touched on before, what we have found in almost all of these organisations was that the governing bodies, those responsible for overseeing the organisation, often didn't know what they didn't know. So one of the big lessons out of this was to shift our framework to one that supported those governing body members to be able to get the assurance that they need that their organisation is performing as it needs to perform, and so deliver good outcomes for tenants and other service users. So the assurance statements are an important part of that, but equally the work that we're doing to support the sector to develop guidance that would be available for those governing body members and others to use. So the work that we've done along with the representative bodies of landlords that George has touched on to develop a toolkit has been well received in the sector, and I think these twin approaches of setting out clear regulatory requirements for self-assurance and transparency alongside the support that is provided through guidance and other tools through these regulatory these representative
and
bodies.
as you identify, it's all about ensuring that they know what the rules are, what the governance might be, what the scrutiny might be, what they require to do in the way of ensuring that their mission statement, everything else they have is, and we have got some very good examples of where that is the case. So you can look at and you can give them examples, and you can show them where they may need to improve because others are doing it in a much more professional or in a better way that they can then copy or they can then substitute or support. So when you consider all of that, can I ask, does the regulator do enough to consider the value for money when it's using statutory powers themselves? Because that's a key issue as well as to how that is managed. And is there a greater need for transparency and oversight of the costs incurred when that does take place as a statutory action?
It's clearly a very important element. There are consequences of statutory intervention, and there are costs to statutory intervention, and those costs fall on the organisation that is subject to that intervention, and that's set out in the Housing Scotland Act 2010. And we work hard to try and ensure that we will minimise the impact of any statutory intervention in terms of cost. Although I'm always minded by some of the feedback that we've had from organisations that have been through statutory intervention, where they recognise that actually the cost of not tackling the weaknesses in the organisation would have been considerably more significant. And indeed, they see some cost benefits coming out of the improvements that are delivered through statutory intervention. So I think there are these impacts, and one of the things that we want to do through the new regulatory frameworks is obviously create a situation where we are having to use these powers less frequently, because the best way to avoid some of the consequences of statutory intervention are not to have the organisation move to a place where that's necessary.
And can I ask about if you've started any work with the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations and the Glasgow and West of Scotland Forum for Housing Associations? Have you started to progress with them on this whole situation? And if not, when will that potentially begin?
We have regular engagements with both those organisations and indeed with the Association of Local Authority Chief Housing Officers to look at what work we can do in each of our own areas, but also jointly to try and ensure that the sector is as resilient and performing as well as it possibly can, so that this type of action by us becomes less and less frequent and less necessary. The toolkit which we have developed is a very obvious output from that, and we're continuing to work with the bodies, the representative bodies, to see how we can enhance that and put additional guidance out for landlords. And one area that we're focusing on most immediately will be around equalities and human rights.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Just before I go on to Andy Whiteman, can I ask, I see that 9 local authorities never submitted their annual assurance statement in time. Can you give us an update on that and tell us why you think this came about and what you intend to do about it, basically?
Okay. It was 9 landlords in total that didn't submit on the 31st of October, 2 registered social landlords and 7 local authorities. The position is now that we've had a number of those in since the submission date, and we also expect a number before the end of the month. Some of it was around timing issues about committee dates within the local authority. We're engaging with all the organisations that didn't submit on time, just to ensure that next time round their calendars or diaries are such that doesn't become a problem. There are only now 3 landlords who are in a position where they don't have an annual assurance statement to provide to us, and we're engaging with those directly.
Okay, right, thanks for that. Andy?
Thanks very much, Convener. Thank you for coming today. I've got some questions around homelessness, but they'll follow, I think, Sarah Boyack's line of questioning shortly. So I'll leave that for the moment. But I just wanted to look at the question of the government's proposed rapid rehousing programme, so-called Housing First, which this committee was quite concerned with a couple of years ago. And I note that in the latest report from the Homelessness Prevention and Strategy Group, as an action on in relation to rapid rehousing transition plans, on discussions with the Scottish Housing Regulator around alignment of their engagement and rapid rehousing transition plans. Can you say something about those discussions and what impact you think they're going to have on RLCLs in particular, but also on councils?
We start with that one because some of the discussions we had around that subject in fact originated at board level, and I'm sure Michael will have just a bit more detail on it. When the issue of rapid rehousing plans emerged, and I must say to their credit, government officials were sharing quite a lot of information with us as the regulator on the kind of approach, we realised that there was a potential for, if you like, conflict between what a regulator was doing and what those plans might say, in particular around the whole issue of homelessness. What we absolutely wanted to avoid was a scenario where anyone that we were regulating thought it would be okay to come to the regulator and say, when we were engaging with them on homelessness, and say, it's okay, there's a rapid rehousing plan, come back in 5 years. And I'll be honest, we had that discussion as a board, and we called officials in to meet with us to talk through some of those concerns. And I don't think I'd be sharing any secrets if I said Michael and I also met with the Minister to talk about it. So we were, if you like, flagging the concerns there were, albeit from a point of view that our starting point was that the idea of rapid rehousing plans seemed like a good thing. There's certainly a level of detail in there that wasn't there before, and indeed a level of transparency, which is really very helpful. We were just simply flagging that it would be very important that we looked at this in a sensible way, and we were flagging to the sector as well that actually the answer, when the regulator discussed homelessness with them, the answer would not be that there's a rapid rehousing plan and therefore everything's okay, talk to us in 5 years. And indeed, I think we've been fairly public in saying if we felt that what was in any individual rapid rehousing plan didn't meet the regulator's requirement for a given landlord, or wasn't producing a set of appropriate outcomes, we would be saying that, and we would be critical of it to individual organisations. What we didn't want to leave was any thought that the regulator would just go away in the subject of homelessness because rapid rehousing plans would take over. So that's the genesis of how this came up as an issue and how we thought about it. Michael, things you'd add?
Yeah, I think just as you've said, George, our focus will remain principally on the outcomes that are being delivered for people who are homeless or threatened with homelessness. So particularly around access to services, access to temporary accommodation, and the permanent solutions that are being found for people who are homeless. Those will remain our principal focus. We recognise that the rapid rehousing transition plans are now the focus for most local authorities on how they will achieve those outcomes and make some of the changes that are necessary to ensure that they continue to deliver on those outcomes. So they are something that we are considering in our engagements with each local authority. But as George has said, we will remain principally focused on the delivery of the outcomes, and particularly the delivery of those statutory duties that local authorities have towards people who are homeless or threatened with homeless. I think in terms of your question around RSLs and the impact on them, I think rapid rehousing transition plans are an opportunity to put that onto a different footing for local authorities. We've already reported that most RSLs make a significant contribution to supporting their local authority to deliver on their duties, but that's not necessarily always universally been the case. So I think rapid rehousing transition plans are an opportunity to address those areas where perhaps the contribution needs to be more significant than it currently is.
So is it fair to say then that the regulator's approach to this has been to try and assess the potential impact of this change in policy on your functions or the perception of your functions, and that you haven't actually identified any particular issues in relationship to your responsibilities that have arisen as a consequence of them? It's more been a question of making sure that they don't get in the way of you continuing to do your job and focusing on the outcomes.
I think that's a good categorisation, actually, a good explanation of it. It was ensuring, here was this new policy initiative, which on the face of it seemed like a good thing. You know, anything that is getting a transparent, open, proper, plan around, rehousing people it seems to us as a good thing. We just saw the potential for a little bit of confusion around that, and that's why we had very open discussions with officials, the minister, and around the sector, just to make sure that wouldn't happen, because the nature of what the policy and government is trying to achieve, and the nature of what a regulator has to do is a wee bit different. And so it was about coordinating that and making it as effective as it all could be.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Tom?
Yes, can I raise the subject of rents and forward in three areas? First of all, the rents arisen in the last year. Do you expect that rise to continue through within the plan you've got? And also, in terms of whether they're perceived as affordable, you're at 86% or thereabouts of affordability, or judging to be so. Given that this type of housing is, if you like, non-market orientated, that should be much higher, because you can't get much cheaper than this. So why is that figure still at 80-something%? It should be in the sort of 95% really. And also, when you're having rent increases and trying to establish affordability with the tenants, how are you communicating this with tenants, and what discussions are taking place?
Okay, a few things in there. I'll maybe make a start on that. We touched on the numbers and the increases of where in the last year, and we're always, that's the year ending April, we're always a year behind with these things, as you understand, the year we're reporting on. So as I said in my opening remarks, the rent increase for last year was 3.7%, projected 3% this year, so both above inflation. That was the highest that it has been since we as a regulator have been monitoring that. To give you a wee bit of context, the highest rent increase in Scotland was 6.9%. That's pretty significant. And so we are paying attention to that around affordability. Let me say, though, what we're not saying rents are too high, because in fact we've given evidence to this committee before that said, for most people, at a given point in time that the rents are they tell us the rents are affordable. But what we were saying from the two groups I talked about, Mr Mason, the tenant panel, indeed the meetings we had within the last month with the RTO groups, was that they were beginning to worry about future affordability and those future increases for reasons that we've seen. To add a wee bit more context to what I said, 80% of landlords in Scotland last year increased rents above inflation. And so really where we're coming from with that is to ask people just to be aware that there are some tenant concerns about that, because that's an 80% increase, 80% of landlords increasing above inflation is a big number. And there were some significant rent increases in there. So asking for landlords to really be aware that there are tenant sensitivities around this, and of course really pursue value for money and cost efficiencies wherever they can. And that's not to suggest that many don't already do that. In terms of how we engage and communicate with tenants around this stuff, then a lot of that is through our tenant panel, back and forth from REM, and through we engage significantly with the regional tenant organisations. We don't have the ability nor the budgets to go out and talk to every tenant where we can, so we focus on those areas, and then we move on to engaging with some of the larger tenant organisations. So TIS and TPAS, for example, I'll be making a keynote speech at the TPAS annual conference this year in December, talking to tenant representatives, tenant activists, to make sure that we are getting the message out as to where our concerns might lie. Michael, would you pick up that second point?
Yeah, I think around affordability, as George has said, our sense is that most homes are affordable for most people as things stand. However, given the increases that we have seen and the projected increases, it's about future affordability that we're raising the concern. So it's about what landlords are doing to keep rents affordable. And of course, what is an affordable rent is a complex matter. There's a lot of issues in that interact, benefits, tax credits, trade-offs with fuel costs in any homes. All of this have an impact on what is affordable in any particular context. And of course, not all landlords are starting from the same place. Some have significantly lower rents than others, and therefore may be in a position to increase rents while keeping them affordable. But I guess the simple arithmetic is that if rents continue to increase at above inflation, then they are likely to become less affordable for people. And that's our message to landlords. It's to consider future affordability when they're looking at rent increases, and in particular to be asking themselves that they're doing everything possible to drive cost out of their businesses before they look to pass that on to their tenants.
Thank you.
Okay, Tom?
Yep.
Okay, thanks very much. Sarah?
Thanks. I would like to move you on to the issue of homelessness and local authorities, and it's something that the committee's worked on in the past, and there were two reports in particular to get your reflections on. Firstly, SHR updated work on the experience of people who are homeless in the last year, and also the National Scrutiny Plan from Audit Scotland highlighted the scrutiny that the regulator's undertaking. So it's really just to get your take on where local authorities are with their work on homelessness and supporting people. And I suppose I was trying to think, what are the indicators in terms of quality and appropriateness of services that local authorities are providing that are meeting the needs of people who are homeless, because there have been some criticisms about their effectiveness. And is it 22 local authorities being scrutinised for the quality of their services to people who are homeless?
In our annual report, we reported that in the previous year we had been engaging with 20 local authorities on the quality of their homelessness service. In this current year, we are engaging with 23 local authorities around homelessness. The key things that we're looking to engage on are, for 18 local authorities, it's around access to the services, how easy it is for people to get the help that they need at the point that they need it. We're engaging with 20 around the quality of the assessments that the local authorities are making against the statutory duties and requirements. We're engaging with 15 local authorities on access to and the quality of the temporary accommodation that they provide. And finally, we're engaging with 22 local authorities around the final outcomes for people who are homeless. Now, we recognise that local authorities are facing a lot of challenges around this, and undoubtedly some of the impacts of the rollout of universal credit are making things more challenging still for local authorities. We've already touched on rapid rehousing transition plans, which I think has put a lot of the work and discussion around homelessness onto a different footing. So that's to be welcome. Homelessness, as you can tell from the numbers that we've touched on, remains a key priority to us. We've already discussed how we are very mindful of the work that is being done with the Scottish Government and local authorities around rapid rehousing. And as I touched on before, our principal focus in this regard will remain on the journey of the person who is homeless through that system, to ensure that they can access the help they need at the point they need it, and that local authorities are discharging all the duties that they owe to those people.
That's really useful, and it does highlight the extent to which there's a crisis out there and it's a struggle. One of the things we looked at in our budget scrutiny this year was preventative spend. So I've got that frame in my head as well. What will you be doing as a regulator on homelessness in the coming months? Because that's clearly quite a high level of intervention with a lot of local authorities. And what outcomes or improvement of service will you be looking for from local authorities?
I think the main focus of our engagement with local authorities around homelessness will be for us to get the necessary assurance that local authorities are in a place to discharge those statutory duties that they owe to people who are homeless, and that in so doing they're providing the appropriate forms of assistance to those people. I've touched on it before. It's about access to services and to the statutory assessments process. The speed and effectiveness of those assessments is something that we monitor. Access to temporary accommodation, quality of temporary accommodation, and then how quickly people are being moved into permanent homes, permanent solutions for them. Those are the kind of key things that we'll continue to focus on over the coming period.
Thanks very much. You want to come in on this one, Andy, before I go on to my next questions on homelessness?
Well, Andy can come back in.
Yeah, okay. That's really useful. I think very keen to come back to that, because it's certainly been an issue for me as casework with people who are incredibly vulnerable, not getting timely support. The other thing I was going to ask about was about gypsy travellers and the work that's been done there. That was another issue that came up in the National Scrutiny Plan from Audit Scotland. And it was just to ask what engagement the regulators got with the gypsy traveller community when looking at site conditions and the quality of what people are having to experience.
Yeah, you're right. That did indeed come up, and you might remember that we published a significant review of where the providers were with Gypsy Traveller site standards in June 2018. It was myself who launched it, actually. And when we launched that, it really wasn't a very nice picture, to be honest. Less than half of the sites met the standards. And I suppose I should only be fair and stress these are minimum standards. They're pretty rudimentary. No one would claim that they are aspirational. And indeed, we understand the Scottish Government is looking at what they might do with those and enhancing those standards going forward. So June 2018, less than half the sites met those minimum standards. As it sits here today, and by the end of October this year, 23 of the 28 sites were in compliance. We have continued to engage with both Gypsy Travellers themselves and I suppose more importantly for the standards perhaps, with the 4 landlords who run the 5 sites that are not in compliance. There's one which happens to be in Scottish Borders that had expected to be in compliance by the end of October, and they've just come back to us saying it will be a few more weeks, but only a few more weeks, so that's now down to 4. In terms, though, of how we're engaging with the community in a number of ways, we had representatives from the Gypsy Traveller and the community in to meet with us 2 months ago, I think I'm right in saying, Michael, and Michael led that discussion. We have representatives of the Gypsy Traveller community within our tenant panel that I touched on, and a part of that, indeed, we've tried to talk up, trying to get more members into that. We've gone through a recruitment exercise to our panel. So there's a number of ways we do it, but it is more through both the panel and representatives. So the final thing I'd say, just on a personal note, is I've gone out to Gypsy Traveller sites. The last site I visited actually was in Dumfries and Galloway, which was one of the non-compliant sites. I did a joint visit, as it happens, with the Minister, and indeed with one of the co-chairs, John Mills from Alacho, because it's something that we're all quite focused on, and that was a very interesting visit to make and to get an understanding of what the tenants on that site felt about it. So just another example of how we would engage with the community.
That's really useful. I think the only final point I would have then is it's now down to quite a small number. How do you keep that monitoring process going to ensure that the final sites are brought into compliance and are of a good standard and quality for people to live there?
And a very fair question, and that is ongoing regulatory engagement with that. So in terms of down to the sites, I gave the example, not trying to name Scottish Borders, but I gave the example of the end of October, a few more weeks. So there's some reassurance that that's moving forward. In terms of where we are, Aberdeen City Council are telling us that they won't comply until June 2020. So if you like, there's a time scale and a plan in place for all. Aberdeenshire Council are expecting to comply by December of this year. Dumfries and Galloway is the challenging one. They do have some challenges there, and that they would tell us that one of the sites is expected to comply end of the year into early next year, but there's another where they're really going to, and in fact it's the site I visited, the other is where they're going to have to decide a strategy for the way forward, because there are some particular issues on that site which would make becoming compliant really a very large challenge. So I'm guessing that because they have to revisit the strategy for that might be the outlier. So it's that ongoing dialogue and engagement, day-to-day, the day-to-day work of a regulator, actually, Ms. Boyack, that will continue to do.
That's really helpful. Thanks very much.
Okay,
Thanks, Convener.
thank you, Andy. You wanted to come back, Andy?
Yes, thank you. I just want to come back on the homeless. One of your statutory objectives is safeguarding and promoting the interests of persons who are or may become homeless under Section 2 of the 2010 Act. It's not clear from your report how you do that. You say on page 17 that there are some insights into people's experience of homelessness services. On page 16 you talk about the services that are provided by local authorities, but how deep and extensive is your engagement with people who are or may become homeless?
We have an annual process through the National Panel of Tenants and Service Users that include people who either are homeless, experiencing homeless at that point, or have had lived experience of homelessness. And we use that to get a better understanding of the priorities of those people in terms of the delivery of service to them. What we also do, though, I think, is when we are engaging with a local authority, if there are opportunities for us to engage directly with people who are homeless, then we will do that in those circumstances. Principally, though, we look to the landlords themselves, the local authorities themselves, to demonstrate how they are engaging with users of the service, to understand properly what their requirements, what their needs are, and what their priorities are, and also what they see as any necessary improvements to the service that are required. And we measure, and we look to use the measurements that those local authorities have around satisfaction with the service delivery. So that's a way in which we get a sense of what is key and important to people who make use of the services of local authorities. And then, as I've said, our principal reason for engaging with local authorities is around the quality of the homelessness service.
Can I maybe add? Would you mind if I added a couple of things to that, Mr. Whitman? Because I think they're quite interesting, actually. And that is that one of the things that comes up a lot in discussions, certainly when I'm at landlord visits or we're talking to groups of landlords, is the whole discussion around tenancy sustainment. and what they do. And there's a lot of landlords out there do a lot of work. Is it perfect? No, nothing ever is. But there's a lot of landlords who do a lot of work around that sustaining tenancy thing, and it's a big part of the discussion we have with landlords. And the final thing I'm going to say, which I think will begin to give us more sight in the future, is that we now have a board member who on the board of SHR who has some actual lived experience of being homeless and becoming homeless, and I think that will give us some extra insight, and I'm really delighted that's the case. I'd love to claim the credit, but of course the Minister actually makes the appointment. I was lucky enough to be in the appointment panel, and when that young woman came through, the panel was very supportive, and then the Minister appointed her. So I think that will give us that extra bit of insight, and indeed already we're seeing in some of the early board meetings we're having that subject come just that bit more to the fore. I'm not suggesting we're ignoring it before, but when you've got someone there who's got lived experience in an area like that, it helps focus the mind.
So your principal means is via the panel members. You said that through your engagement with local authorities, if there's the opportunity, you'll do some engagements. That's ad hoc. You engage with local authorities about the service, but your principal method is the panel members. I mean, can I suggest that panel members are people that you recruit and they join the panel and all the rest of it, and they sit on the panel for how long typically?
It can vary from a year to 3 or 4 years.
So a lot of people that are homeless are coming in and out of homelessness on very rapid cycles. Given that one of your statutory objectives is to safeguard and promote the interests of the persons who are or may become homeless, can I suggest you maybe need to do more to focus on the safeguarding and promoting the interests of the persons?
I think that's absolutely at the heart of what we do, and we would look for all opportunities to try and get as good an understanding of the interests of those individuals as we possibly can. So we will continue to look for other opportunities to do just that.
Okay, thank you.
Alexander wanted to come in briefly and then
carrying on from that, you know, local authorities have the increasing expectation about how they manage and they secure accommodation for individuals. But can I ask you in your report you talk about the quality of temporary accommodation. Now that is a major issue across some council areas because there seems to be quite a vast range of quality in accommodation. Some councils having excellent and others who are finding it difficult to try and find that temporary accommodation that is sustainable and that has the quality of the need. So can I ask how are you supporting on managing that situation across to investigate and see exactly what where the bar is being set, because as I say, many are actually achieving over the bar, but some are well beneath the bar.
Temporary accommodation and the quality of temporary accommodation is unquestionably one of the kind of key things that comes through in our assessments of local authorities, and it's an area of significant focus for us. There are a number of policy developments in that regard. The Scottish Government fairly recently announced the adoption of, at the moment, advisory standards for temporary accommodation, with an objective to move those standards onto a statutory footing. And certainly at the point where they are moved onto a statutory footing, we would see it as within our role to start to monitor performance against those very standards. So it's a developing area, I think, it's safe to say, and one that we will consider how we adjust our approach to regulation when those standards start to become an obligation on landlords.
Thank you.
And that's something I would just add that we have had discussions with both the Minister and officials on that whole issue around the new standards, because we as a regulator see that as a really significant step forward, in fact, because of course as a regulator we're also charged with being proportionate, and actually so much more helpful to demonstrate that when there are a very clear set of standards in place that we can rigorously monitor, assess and report on. So we see that as a very helpful thing.
Thank you. Kenny, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I mean, one of the statutory underpinnings of the regulator is that you, and I quote, safeguard and promote the interests of current and future tenants. Now, since I was first elected as a councillor in 1992, the issue in relation to housing that's most been brought to my attention has been the issue of alleged antisocial behaviour. So I'm just wondering if there are what the trends are in terms of the number of cases being brought to the attention of social landlords. How have things evolved or changed over the years in terms of the number of cases being brought, and also how they're being dealt with, and if there's a significant difference in the approach of RSLs in, relative to local authorities.
I'll pick up on that, and I don't have the actual statistical information in front of me. I can certainly get that for the committee. We do monitor on an annual basis information from both local authorities and RSLs around antisocial behaviour cases and the outcomes of those antisocial behaviour cases, so we can provide that information. It's I think something that's very live for individuals in communities where they experience this. I would say it's not necessarily something that comes through significantly in the risk assessment as being a major problem. I think most local authorities and RSLs now have well-developed approaches to dealing with antisocial behaviour, and usually that involves a coordination with a range of agencies, not just the landlord themselves, because of course the landlord is only able to act on some aspects of antisocial behaviour, not the full range of behaviours that can impact on individuals within the community. But I'm happy to pull that information together and provide that to the committee.
Okay, but is there a difference in approach between RSLs and local authorities? I mean, in terms of outcomes, because I mean, I've got a couple of live cases like this. I've always had a couple of live cases. I can't remember a time when I did any of these kind of cases. And one of the reasons why they're live is because for the people who are the victims of such behaviour, it seems to take an inexorable amount of time to resolve them. So, for example, you could be phoning the police out twice a week, you're reporting to the antisocial behaviour team, etc., for week after week. So you might be doing that for months, and then for a couple of months you don't have any cause to complain. And then when it restarts, it's well, it wasn't a problem the last couple of months. And they said, well, we had months and months of this, you know, and you know, the thing restarts and you end up with cases going on 2-3 years, people's lives frankly ruined. So that's why I've raised this issue, because it's a really important, critical issue for the individuals concerned, and there's a real worry that these issues are not being addressed timelessly from the point of view of the individual concerned. I mean, I'll just give you one instance of a couple whose lives have been completely made a misery by someone who plays music, all sorts of time, you know, a day, jumping about in with big heavy boots to keep them awake at night, all that kind of stuff. The council then said when they complained to council, the council then told the person who was supposedly the perpetrator that they were going to put noise monitoring equipment in, you know. So they actually told, so the person was silent as a mouse for a couple of weeks. Bizarrely, you know, there was no incidence of noise. Half an hour after the equipment had been taken out, the noise started again. So it's just about how this is being, if there's a model of best practice which can be used across Scotland, either in RSLs or in local authorities, that can help alleviate some of the problems for some of the people who are actually suffering from these very, important issues from their perspective at this time.
I think there are models of best practice, and I think they're well understood by social landlords in general. I think one of the challenges for social landlords is the limitations on their on the tools that are available to them to be able to address this. The most obvious one is that, you know, the legal route, and that requires a significant volume of evidence to be gathered together to present to courts for action to be taken. So it's not a straightforward and simple action for landlords to take, whether that's to seek an antisocial behaviour order or to initiate eviction proceedings against perpetrators in the more significant cases. So it's not a straightforward process from the perspective of landlords, but absolutely recognise that what that can mean is that for the individuals that are at the receiving end of antisocial behaviour, it can feel very frustrating and difficult.
Just one last question.
Yeah, but
on this
I'll
one.
let you in a minute, Kenny.
Yeah,
So, I'll let you in a minute, Kenny.
Oh, sorry.
Aye. So if you say that you've got examples of best practice when you're writing to us with the information that you're already doing so, can you give the answer to the question that Kenneth asked about the difference between RSLs and local authorities, if you have it, and also the best practice that you were talking about?
Certainly happy to do that. I would say I'm not aware of any significant difference in practice between local authorities and RSLs in this. I think it's the same legislative framework that they both operate under, and the range of tools that are available to them are broadly the same. Local authorities may have more immediate access to some other tools and resources within the broader council setup, but pretty much it's the same approach that most landlords would take.
And it'd be interesting to see if the outcomes are the same for both.
I mean, just on the legal framework, I'm just wondering if you feel there's any way in which that can be improved, because obviously everyone's innocent till proven guilty, but one of the issues I have is that some of the people who come to me are quite elderly people, you know, they just want a quiet life. They might be in their 70s or 80s, and they've got a couple next door to them who are causing havoc, you know, parties, allegations of drugs and fighting in the street and all this kind of stuff. Nightmare situation. So how can we shift the balance, if you like, in terms of the victim? How can we expedite the process? How can we improve the legislative framework so that whatever the outcome of an investigation, it's expedited rather than taking month after month after month? It takes years off people's lives, these issues, frankly. How can we improve things? That's what I'm saying.
There'll be people better qualified than I am to comment on potential improvements to the legislative framework and the legal process. I mean, certainly where I've seen this work best, it's where the range of agencies that have a role and an interest in this are working effectively together. That unquestionably is the situation that delivers the best outcomes and the speediest outcomes. And I think that's what most landlords look to achieve, whether it always necessarily works in that way. And obviously all organisations out there are under significant pressures in terms of availability of resources. But it's that coordination of response that I think delivers the most effective outcome.
And I would add, actually, really interestingly, this came up when we did the consultation events across Scotland. And the framework we talked about earlier, we did, I think it was 10 tenant events across Scotland. This came up in a couple of them. And in fact, that point that Michael's just made around multi-agency approach, it wasn't a huge part of the discussion, I should say, because it wasn't a big part of what we were proposing to do in the framework. But where it came up, the comment came from a number of tenants. Now, to be clear, this is just anecdotal that I'm sharing with you, because it came up, was that it did seem to be more effective where there was that coordinated multi-agency approach. And, landlords, of course, were touched on, police were certainly touched on, and interestingly, so were social services. And I certainly heard in those at least one, quite a very good example, actually, I recall, of that working best when the agencies got together and coordinated it. And maybe what didn't work was where it was an individual trying to do it. So that's entirely anecdotal. I just want to be upfront about that. But it was an interesting discussion.
I don't think anyone wants to go down the road of evicting people if there can be other solutions, for example. But mediation has been talked about, and some people clearly don't feel they want to involve themselves in mediation. But I mean, I was involved personally in a case 30 odd years ago when I went round to remonstrate with the person. They basically just didn't actually realise they were actually causing so much noise, and it just stopped after that, and I never had any further problems. But in terms of mediation, is there any evidence on how successful or not it might have been, and whether or not that's something that's being used more and more, for example? Because it may be that people just don't actually realise they're causing the problems they are until the police knock their door, and sometimes these things can escalate.
I don't have any immediately available or recent evidence of research into the effectiveness of mediation, but it is absolutely one of the tools that's available to landlords, and is often one of the things which landlords will employ early on in an identified problem. if it's appropriate for mediation, and not all aspects of antisocial behaviour would be appropriate for mediation, but the type of examples that you've highlighted, where it's about perhaps lifestyle clashes, to call them that, that's where the tool of mediation can be particularly effective.
Okay, Mr. Callan, if you could send the information that you have. Kenneth raised a really important point. It's one I've got no doubts that we're going to be raising with other bodies. But we'll move on to Tom. You wanted to come back to something.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I endorse entirely everything that Kenneth Gibson has said as a local councillor in Aberdeen. 50% of my post bag is taken up with disruptive neighbours of one piece or another. And this is emphasised when it's a mixed tenement with private owners and council or housing association mixture. And my experience is that it may work when everybody's coordinated together, but they rarely do. In fact, as far as I know, they never do, because they have, each of the organisations involved have a different overall objective, which don't match together at a particular point. So, I mean, something really does need to be done about it. And I could retire from council quite happily if that would happen. But
we all have to work together to make sure that Tom can retire from council as soon as he possibly can.
And my other main point is have you taken into consideration anywhere, and I don't see it mentioned, in terms of empty accommodation and the quantity of that and the turnover and re-letting of properties in general? I don't see any information on that.
We monitor landlords' performance on reletting empty properties. So we have information on both the volume. We also measure the rent lost as a consequence of empty homes. So I'm more than happy to get that information to the committee.
Thank you very much. I've just got a couple of questions. In the annual report, page 25, there's a number of challenges, risks and uncertainties identified for social landlords. One of them is about the transparency and cost and value for money within RSLs. What particular cost pressures are they facing, and are you confident that they have the financial capacity to cope with these additional pressures?
Yeah, I think there are a range of challenges there for social landlords, and our focus is very much on risk. And some of the pressures that we see, and I'm arguably sorry to lower the tone of the conversation by mentioning the Brexit word, but we're very alive to the potential risks that there are out of Brexit for social landlords, and especially a no-deal Brexit. We are conscious of the potential impacts from supply chain disruption around maintenance and new build. Also, labour shortages potentially in the maintenance and construction industry, but also some of the broader macroeconomic impacts that could have consequences for social landlords. So if there's any significant changes around inflation or in currency, then those could have quite significant cost impacts for social landlords. And those potential emerging risks around Brexit are sitting alongside some of the perhaps more familiar risks that we see for social landlords. Issues around management of pension deficit remains a challenge for social landlords. We are monitoring closely the position around rent arrears that might have an impact that drives out of the rollout of universal credit to social landlords. So there's a range of risks that we are aware of and that we monitor closely, and that will drive how we then set out our engagement with each landlord.
Thank you for that. So is there a link then between the welfare reforms, particularly universal credit, the rent arrears, and then the higher rises that social landlords are having to impose on their tenants?
It's undoubtedly the case that the main contributing factor to any rise in arrears, and we've seen a bit of a rise in arrears in the latest figures, is likely to be from the rollout of universal credit rather than from any other significant factor. We're not necessarily seeing the increase in arrears as a consequence of universal credit being a driver for rent increases, and equally we're not necessarily seeing rent increases being a driver for arrears. I think it's a more complex picture than that. So the arrears have gone up slightly. They've gone up at a higher level for local authorities than for RSLs, and we suspect that's as a direct consequence of the rollout of universal credit having a more immediate impact on some of the local authority landlords.
Okay. And is there any, do you have any comments? You don't need, if there isn't, you don't need comment, but about any further challenges, risks or uncertainties for social landlords that you haven't mentioned already?
I think there's an increased level of expectation on social landlords. Earlier this week, freedom of information was extended to registered social landlords. That unquestionably will have an impact on social landlords. We know that they have to give further consideration to investment strategies and plans, looking to the next iteration of each of the, and immediately now I can't remember what each stands for. But the climate change response to by landlords, and that will require further investment in stock. So there are a range of other expectations that are coming around for landlords that they have to respond to. I think there's also the reality for a lot of landlords around the withdrawal of services within local communities, and particularly registered social landlords looking to the consequence of the withdrawal of those services and whether they have to look to provide an alternative or a mitigation to some of that. So these are the kind of challenges and pressures that there are on registered social landlords, and that's the type of risks and impacts that we'll continue to monitor.
And Mr. Dornan, if I can add a couple of things to that, actually, just picking up that really interesting come up in visits and face-to-face with landlords. And East is a significant one, actually. There's definitely visits I've been on where that comes up around the challenges of that, which for some existing stock to get them East compliant can be very expensive. Some of the landlords might say almost unaffordable. And of course, the challenge between demand for housing and people wanting to live in that housing, but the challenges of them getting East compliant. So there's that conundrum definitely that is in the minds of landlords. And the other one that I think I hear quite commonly is landlords, and you hear it more particularly from RSLs, having to step in where there isn't statutory funding and statutory services. So around things like tenancy sustainment, access to benefits, assisting people with benefits, a whole host of areas where they're seeing maybe some parts of the third sector are struggling for money, maybe pulling back, and certainly statutory services pulling back. So I think there's some landlords that would say to us that they're finding they're having to step into that void sometimes, and that, in fairness to them, would be a challenge.
Just one last question then. Do you feel the regulator is suitably prepared for the changes to its powers as a result of provisions in the Housing Scotland Amendment Act 2018?
Yes, and the principal change in that regard was the removal of consents where landlords required to obtain regulatory consent for a number of disposals that they might make of assets, or changes to constitution. So those changes have now taken place. We have reflected that in the new regulatory framework that was brought in on the 1st of April. And that has gone relatively smoothly in terms of the guidance we've put out for landlords and landlords' response to that. It shifted the duty from obtaining our consent to one to notify us. So we have seen a significant increase in the number of notifications that we receive from social landlords, but that's entirely in line with what we'd have expected to see.
Okay. In that case, can I thank you both for attending today's evidence session, and that concludes the public part of today's meeting. I now move this meeting into private. Thank you.